Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel for this year's Bryce Wood Book Award. My name is Angela Stacey, and it has been an honor for me to serve as the chair of the selection committee for the Bryce Wood Book Award this year. I am located at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I'm an anthropologist, but there was a diversity of members who I'll recognize in just a minute. But really, we are here today to recognize Bret Gustafson for his book, Bolivia in the Age of Gas by Duke University Press. I want to thank, before we get started, this year's LASA president, Gerardo Otero, also LASA executive director, Milagro Pereira Rojas, and of course this year's program co-chairs, but especially the committee for the Bryce Wood Book Award this year. This year was a smallish committee. There were, I think, 8 of us total. Dania Abreu Torres from Trinity University in the United States, Claudio Barrientos, Universidad Diego Portales in Chile, Edmé Dominguez from Gothenburg University in Sweden, Tulia Fayetti from the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, Michelle Lee Farrell from Fairfield University in the US, Jonathan Hartland from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the United States, and finally, Carlos Pérez Ricard from the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas en México. As you may know, the Bryce Wood Book Award is given out annually to an outstanding book on Latin America in the social sciences and humanities published in English. And this year, this relatively small selection committee reviewed 111 nominations. The committee met, it was a remarkable amount of work for 8 people. The committee met on 3 occasions. We conducted 2 rounds of review to arrive at 1 winner and 3 honorable mentions. So I'm going to share with you the selection criteria. I'm going to congratulate the honorable mentions, and then I will introduce Bret Gustafson to talk about Bolivia in the Age of Gas. So we early on in our selection process, we narrowed it down to 3 criteria. One was significance of contribution to the field of Latin American studies. We were looking for contributions that were truly noteworthy and likely to be cited, discussed, and be a building block for future research and scholarship. And books that drew out the implications for Latin American studies beyond their specific topic or country studied. Secondly, we looked at quality, the quality of the research and analysis, looking for innovative interpretation of previously studied phenomena or insight into a new topic. And then lastly, clarity of writing for a Latin Americanist audience. So again, this was a very large pool. There were so many amazing works. We really wanted to be able to give many, many awards. We ended up selecting 3 honorable mentions, and I don't think any of them were able to come today. The first, Federico Freitas, is currently on a flight to Sao Paulo. Federico's book, Nationalizing Nature, Iguazu Falls and the National Parks at the Brazil-Argentina border. The second honorable mention was by Thea Rio Francos. I should have mentioned Freitas's book was published by Cambridge University Press. Rio Franco's book is called Resource Radicals from Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador from Duke University Press. And our third honorable mention by Kristen Winterstein, published by the University of California Press, is called The Fishmeal Revolution, the Industrialization of the Humboldt Current Ecosystem. Again, the book that rose to the top for this committee is Bret Gustafson's Bolivia in the Age of Gas. And our committee found this historical ethnography of Bolivia's Age of Gas fascinating, timely, and uniquely deserving of the 2022 Bryce Wood Book Award. Gustafson's nuanced and multi-scalar account of Bolivia's gasification spans time and space, taking readers on a journey across the last century and from the seat of Bolivian national governance to regionalism in Santa Cruz to Guarani territorial demands. As readers, we delighted in joining Gustafson for his politically engaged analysis of the histories and presence of Bolivian extractivism, examining its complex relationships to foreign capital, political intervention, and US energy empire. Gustafson's deft exploration of the nationalization of natural resources in the contemporary era highlights the ways in which the Morales administration maneuvered to increase and redistribute the state's gas rents while maintaining revenue streams for foreign investors and undermining Guarani struggles for rights and resources, despite his progressive stance and fame as Bolivia's first indigenous president. Well documented, using a multidisciplinary approach and convincingly argued, Bolivia in the Age of Gas represents a vital new wave of research that considers the political and social cost of fossil fuels, alongside ethnic, geographical, and patriarchal forms of exclusion and parallel struggles for environmental, gender, linguistic, and racial justice in Latin America and beyond. Now, when we began planning for this award panel, I reached out to Dr. Gustafson and I said, what should we do? Should we have a bunch of people come and talk about your book? And I was streaming really big and commentators, and Bret said to me, why don't we keep it simple? This is a Sunday afternoon, evening in some places, right? The very end of this really rich conference, and also Mother's Day in the United States. Why don't I just talk about the book for 10 or 15 minutes and then we can open it up for questions? And I thought, that's amazing. Such a breath of fresh air. And like, we're in year 2 of this pandemic and I haven't yet caught on that sometimes simple is better. So Bret, that was instructional for me, and I'm learning from you, and we really just delighted in this book. And I can say on behalf of the entire selection committee, we are really, really happy to grant this year's Bryce Wood Book Award to you. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Bret Gustafson to talk to us about this fantastic work.
Thank you, Angela. I thought you were going to make me cry for a minute. Thank you very much for those kind words, and of course for the award, and to the other judges. I don't know how you read 111 books. I really don't understand how that process works, but I know it took a lot of time, so that I'm really appreciative of that. And congratulations to the honorable mentions and to all of the books, many of which surely equally deserved to be recognized. And I was going to say that, just for the record, I don't know any of these judges, so it's not a question of amistad. However, I do know everyone in the audience, so I would like to thank all of you for showing up on this Sunday afternoon. And for those of you who are madres, feliz Dia de la Madre. And almost everyone I see on the attendee list has played a role in my work and in this book as well. So thank you all very much. You know who you are. So sending abrazos to you too. And I have to say, gracias al pueblo guaraní de Bolivia. No sé si verán este video en algún momento, pero les debo mucho, les debo todo. And to el pueblo de Bolivia en sí, por haberme dejado compartir sus historias y sus luchas. I'll probably switch back and forth from Spanish to English as the mood hits me, but I actually looked up who Bryce Wood was, because I started thinking, who is this person, Bryce Wood, for whom I'm receiving a prize? And is this actually a name that I want, knowing the history of Latin American studies in the United States? So I know you didn't come to hear about Bryce Wood, but part of what I tried to do in the book was pay homage to people who made history in Bolivia mostly, but also, as if you read the book, you'll see there were many interactions between Bolivian scholars and US scholars and activists throughout these histories. But at any rate, Bryce Wood was born in 1909, it died in 1986. This award was started in 1989. And given the possibility of what kind of scholar Wood might have been, having been active during the Cold War, I think one of the obituaries I read said he was a liberal Democrat who was opposed to interventionism. So I'm going to go with that. So I'm going to give Bryce Wood credit for that. He worked at the SSRC for many years, and I don't know what the context was for creating the prize, but whatever it was, I'm appreciative of it. So yeah, that was one of Bryce Wood's main line of research. I mean, there's a connection here, was about military policy and militarism in Latin America. And he actually wrote a book on the United States and Latin American wars, which had a big section on the Chaco War, which I was unaware of until just this afternoon when I started Googling. So that probably should have made it into my book as well, because the Chaco War is a big part of it. And if you're familiar with Bolivia or with the book, you know why that is, because it was a war that most Bolivians think was fought over oil, and to an extent it was. And a lot has been said about that, but because it continues to play a role in the imaginary of what natural gas and oil and revolution mean in Bolivia today, it made up a big part of the book. So these are all questions that are still intensely relevant given what's happening on the planet, increasing militarism both here and abroad, despite climate change, increasing commitment to fossil fuels. So this is a kind of the context that shaped my writing of the book, and I don't know how transparent that is to the reader, but I guess these are themes that we're going to continue researching going forward. So as I told Angela, I didn't want to talk too much, so feel free to wave your hand when I go past about 10 minutes, Angela. I'd love to hear from my friends and colleagues who are here. But at any rate, this was a second book, and second books are different, at least in anthropology, from first books. They take longer to write, at least mine did, because of family and professional obligations. It's not a single period of field work. Field work done over various bits and pieces of time. Did not really start with a clear research question, but emerged out of watching things happen mostly in southeastern Bolivia, where I do most of my work with the Guarani. And as a second book, I also felt more freedom on how to write it, because I wasn't under the constraints of tenure. So, what might not really count as anthropology made it into the book. And the historians out there will say, well, this isn't really history. I say, well, it's not really anthropology either. But at any rate, I appreciate the committee recognizing its value. But it also reflects the fact that I did an undergrad degree in Latin American studies at Tulane many years ago, and I've always sort of felt more comfortable thinking of myself as a Latin American studies interdisciplinary scholar, as a kind of a hardcore anthropologist. So at any rate, what was happening in Guarani country, which gave birth to the book, was the end of my first project on education reform. And this was in the late 90s to early 2000s. Rapidly, when the neoliberal governments privatized natural gas, you had an incredible influx of foreign companies coming into the Guarani region, drilling holes, exploring for gas, building pipelines, a flurry of activity. And I sort of ended my first book on education saying that education, bilingual education, was a platform for organizing a significant and relatively powerful indigenous organization. But once this gas industry started expanding across Guarani country, it fractured communities, it increased corruption among leadership, created all sorts of social impacts, environmental impacts that we still haven't been able to really examine systematically. And of course, what makes up a lot of the book are conflicts over the gas revenues that were generated, that generated a new kind of sort of intensified old forms of politics with new resources that were at play. So over the years, I kept going back, and each year there'd be a conflict. My Guarani friends joked, they said, Gringo, you only show up when we're marching or blockading. What is it? You know what's happening. You've been watching us from the United States, but part of the process that was unfolding as well, along with gas, was of course the rise of Evo Morales and his election to the presidency, which intensified conflicts between the right wing and supporters of Morales. Most of my Guarani friends happen to be supporters of Morales, and they're sort of traditional enemies, for lack of a better word, or the regional cattle ranchers and the right wing. So those conflicts intensified as the right wing attempted to destabilize the Morales government. So that makes up a significant part of the book as well. And of course, despite whatever negative impacts there were of the gas industry, the Guarani also benefited from it, like many Bolivians did, from new state expenditures, but also policies and programs that Mas government targeted toward the Guarani, including indigenous education, indigenous university. Many Guarani leaders were allies of the Mas and got jobs. And so there was definitely deep contradictions in the effect of natural gas and of Evo Morales. And this is what sort of the tone of the book. People sort of sometimes label me as a Masista or a pro Morales person, and in the big scheme of things, okay, I'll take that as opposed to the others out there. But in fact, the book is fairly critical of the Morales government in many parts. I try to be as objective as possible about these contradictions and ambiguities, but also to be loyal to my friends, the ones who are sort of on the front lines and fighting these struggles. And you have to sort of understand from their perspective why backing both Morales and gas development made sense. And that's basically our role as scholars. So, so if you do read the book someday, you'll read about many of these conflicts over regionalism, over Guarani land, over negotiations with gas companies. Those made up the skeleton of the story of the book. There were some other issues that emerged as I was writing that shaped what came out, and which didn't necessarily come out of what was happening on the ground at the time, but I've been teaching and doing research on fossil fuels because of this project. So I have all up in my head the problems and connections between fossil fuels and not just climate change, but war and militarism. And I don't know if I was depressed or angry or what, but it seemed like it was a good opportunity to critique militarism, whether in Bolivia or the United States. And the more I read about the Chaco War, the more incensed I became. It was very much like today, the rising military industrial apparatus, the power of the arms industry, and the power of the banks. It's what we're seeing right now with military aid and military spending in the United States. It's exactly what shaped the emergence of the Chaco War with oil money and the arms industry. And here's where the historians might roll their eyes at how I treated it, but I sort of wove in rereading histories of anti-war activism in the United States with anti-war activism in Bolivia. And there were all these connections that just blew my mind. And thanks to Guillermo Delgado Pérez, a well-known Bolivian scholar, it happened at Alasa. It was at Alasa. I bumped into him and he said, "Here, my father's memoir has been published. You work in the Chaco, you might be interested in." It's a fascinating memoir that his father wrote from the front lines of the Chaco War. So I pulled that into the book as well. His name was Trifonio Delgado Gonzalez, and I salute him here. He made it home alive, but of course, many of his comrades did not. There are other characters like, never heard of, Margaret Alexander Marsh. She was a sociologist who went to Bolivia in 1925. Of course, very early scholar doing fieldwork, but very early woman, one of the few women doing fieldwork in Bolivia. And she had gotten grants from a foundation set up by anti-war folks. It's in a footnote. So dig into the footnotes. You'll see the story. But she ended up doing research on the U.S. loans from the oil banks that sort of funded the Bolivian military expansion. And she published that work in Spanish eventually. And that work made it back to Sergio Almaraz and company, who were Bolivian nationalists writing in the 60s. And they cited her. And I was like, who is this person? And so it's amazing sort of history that I just felt someone had to pay homage to. So for what it's worth, if you dig into the footnotes, you'll see a lot of these interconnections between these histories of oil, militarism, and war. So that was one thing I was grappling with. And another thing was a different kind of violence was the violence that some of my Guarani colleagues had suffered when they're marching for land, but also violence against MAS supporters up in northern Pando and the Amazonian region. Longer histories of political violence in Bolivia, and more recently, the moment in which the Morales government deployed its, I'm not sure the exact name, special forces or Delta Force, something, to basically execute a group of alleged mercenaries who were allegedly plotting against Evo Morales. And when that unfolded, it had all this sort of imagery of Cold War state terror. And as I confess in the book, finally the state was using its violence against these right-wing mercenaries, and I admit, there was a little tinge of good riddance. But the more I talked to my colleagues about it, the more I understood that I personally think there was a plot, but it's so complicated and obscure about what really happened and how it really unfolded. And at the end of the day, they were executed extrajudicially, just like the military dictatorships would have been. And that was a moment of understanding I got to by talking to a lot of Bolivian colleagues who said, look, this isn't the Evo Morales we elected. We didn't elect someone who was going to use state violence in this way. And so I try to reflect, with all my limitations of being a gringo, on that in that chapter, the role of basically of dead bodies in Bolivia. And it's curious, one of the reviewers said that they didn't understand how that chapter fit into a book about gas. And I guess my point was, well, you can't talk about Evo or gas or recent Bolivian history without talking about the politics of death, so to speak. So that was emerged as another chapter. And then finally, I guess, and I'll conclude here, and here I know there's some Bolivian scholars in the attendees who know Zavaleta much better than I do. So please don't out me for being a novice on René Zavaleta, but among others, scholars that I try to dialogue with, most of them Bolivia, as well as non-Bolivian scholars about fossil fuels. I have been asked to read Zavaleta's obra completa for a press that was considering translating it. And I was like, oh my God, Zavaleta is writing basically Bolivia in the age of gas, but 50 years ago, when it was about oil and the military dictatorships and what was to be done with the capture of the excess or excedente, the excess wealth that the Bolivian elite had never been able to capture and use to create a modern nation. They had simply squandered it, robbed it, or used it in war. And so Zavaleta had this key phrase. A lot of people talk about Zavaleta's concept of sociedad abigarrada, but I don't really engage too much with that in the book. I grabbed onto, among others, he is also very excoriated the Bolivian elite for being racist and feckless. And I just love his writings. I have little phrases of his stuck up around here. A fearless writer like Almaraz was Sergio Almaraz, and Marcelo Quiroga Santa Cruz, others who were just fearlessly writing against the military and the racist elite. But at any rate, Zavaleta has a piece called La Querella del Excedente, the struggle or the quarrel over the excess. And I sort of engage in that in the last part of the book, because basically this is what the story of gas is about. It was a battle over what to do with all this extra money. That was it, the quarrel over the excess. And of course, in the neoliberal and privatization scheme of the past, that would have been, let the market decide. And most of it would have gone somewhere else. But under Morales and the MAS, there was a significant effort to capture the excedente, the excess. And one can critique Morales for various sorts of excesses, and that's part of the chapter, is how the idea of wasteful excess was used and deployed against Morales to try to break down his image. But in a political economic sense, I mean, one has to recognize the economic stability, the reduction of poverty, the investment in people. Some of it surely was wasted white elephant projects, but much of it was deeply appreciated and explains the support for Evo. So I try to balance this critical attack of Evo's exuberant and baroque use of excess and excess forms of violence, excess patriarchy, excess sexism, with that sort of, was Morales and the MAS, were they able to do what Zavaleta said no Bolivian government had ever done in the past? And that was try to use the excess to construct a nation. And of course, for those in the deeply polarized moment of Bolivia, I'm not sure anyone really liked what I said, but at any rate, I tried. So, that was another thing I aspired to do in the book, and here the Bolivian scholars who know these theorists and historians better than I do will say, well, you tried. I mean, I don't consider myself a Zavaletian scholar, but at any rate, it was one thing I was trying to do. One of the readers, a reader thought I should engage this French philosopher named Georges Bataille, who has all this stuff on excess. And I've got nothing against French philosophy, but my response was, yeah, that's good. So he got a footnote, but I'll stick with Zavaleta. So I was trying to engage with what Bolivians have been saying about these things for many, many, many decades. So thanks again to Angela, the committee. Thanks to all of you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I wish we could just go to the bar and all have a drink together. But since we can't do that, I look forward to your questions or comments.
That would be amazing to go have a drink and get to talk about this book into the evening. Thank you so much, Bret. So I think a few people showed up while you were speaking. We got a question, which is, can you reintroduce this? So for those who are unsure where you're at, this is the Bryce Wood Book Award panel, and we are here honoring Bret Gustafson for his recent book called Bolivia in the Age of Gas, which was published by Duke. And so we are opening the floor for comments and questions from everyone who's here. If you would like to speak, you can raise your hand and we will give you, the kind people from LASA who know how to operate this webinar will give you access to the mic. If you'd like to, you can drop a question in the Q&A. And Magda, you have talking privileges now if you'd like to unmute and ask a question.
Now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Hello. I am Magda von der Heid, and I know Gustav from other classes. And I'm very, very, very interested in your book. Very interesting. I presented yesterday my book, Latin America, Development Between Populismos and Neopopulismos. And also I have a book about populismos in Bolivia in German. But I want to make a book about Bolivia extractivismos, and I would like to invite you to make a chapter. So I send you my email, and if you can give me your email and we can correspond, we talk about, for the first time, I want to write a book in Spanish. Yeah, I own my country, and really I am looking for contributors for the second part. I don't know if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you. I put my email in the chat, so everyone can email me.
Okay.
Thank you for coming. I look forward to checking out your book.
Yeah.
I will read out questions that are in the Q&A, but again, if folks want to speak, they're welcome to raise their hands, and we'll unmute you so you can dialogue directly with Bret. Bret, this question is from Kevin Healy. you may be able to see it as well, but it says, I would like to ask Bret about Itakaguasu territory and the history of the compensation it received.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Good to see you again here. And Kevin Healy wrote an awesome book many years ago, which shaped my whole first experience in the Guarani region, if you don't know who he is. So Itakaguasu is a province, part of a province of Tarija department in the south that was impacted by gas development. It continues to be impacted by gas development. So this is probably a question that my colleague Penelope Antias would know how to answer better. Penelope did field work there during the gas period. I lived there years prior when I was working on education. All I can say, Kevin, is that particular territory had some success negotiating directly with Repsol, the Spanish multinational oil and gas company. They were being advised by a Spanish NGO called NIZCOR, I believe, NIZKOR. And by relative success, I mean, they claim to have negotiated several millions of dollars that would be held in a Brazilian bank for them to access for development financing. I had intended to write about this in the book, but in the times that I visited the region, the leaders were so intensely posed against each other that there was deep suspicion of everybody on all sides. There were intense conflicts to the point of violence between different factions of leadership within the Itakaguasu leadership because of this money. And I just found it would be ethically, not only ethically challenging, but also, politically challenging to try to dig into this story. So I let it go and I walked away. So Penelope Antias might know more than that. You actually might be more familiar as well of the outcome of this. And I really don't know what has happened, but what I do know is that the different factions of leadership as throughout the Guarani region came to literally blows over this gas money. And that has been one of the major negative impacts of this. I was at a meeting with elder Guarani leaders late, just before COVID. And they were the sort of original leaders of the APG from the early days. And they were trying to figure out how they were going to try to rebuild their organization, which had been deeply fractured by all of this infighting and all of this corruption. So I don't know if that helps you, Kevin, but that's what I know about that.
Thanks, Bret. There's another question from Elizabeth Monasterios. Bret, ¿podrías comentar tu lectura de la última marcha indígena?
I believe there are deeply valid positions that motivated many in that march to march, especially the sort of lack of action on territorial rights and the sort of huge development projects running roughshod over indigenous territories and the expansion of the soy frontier across Santa Cruz. So I think they're really legitimate grievances that many lowland indigenous peoples have against the Maas government. Unfortunately, in the case of that particular march, I believe it was also deeply shaped by the interference of the right-wing opposition, both publicly and privately, in ways that we can't really know about, but which were clear in the way that it was used by the right-wing opposition. And I'm not saying that the indigenous marchers were simply dupes of the right. I'm simply saying that particular political conjuncture, those legitimate grievances were sort of brought into question, but because of the nature of the alliance that was behind that particular moment. And I think at the end of the day, whether you agree with me or not on that point, I think at the end of the day, you have to agree that the Santa Cruz elite were sort of had them camped out in the city somewhere, and then sort of shipped them all back on buses when they were done. And it's really this old style form of politics. But of course, I know there are plenty of people out there who deeply disagree with me on that, but that's my lectura. I would love to hear others on that as well. And un gusto saludarte, Elizabeth. Qué gusto verte aquí. Veo aquí de Pamela en el chat. Bret, talk about a bit more about the patriarchal excesses and the weight of patriarchy in the form of state power that was forged to do the kind of redistribution that the Mas government was able to accomplish. Yes, well, this is a key point that I probably could have done a better job addressing. The whole book sort of implicitly written in that frame. I mean, from the very beginning, when I started doing these oral histories with old oil workers, it's obvious with oil economies everywhere. This is an industry that is masculinist from top to bottom, and it's the symbols of its operations and its technology are all about masculine conquest of nature. Whether you're in South Texas or South Bolivia, this is part of the culture of the oil industry. And that sort of set me on a path which was critiquing that connection between masculinism, violence against nature and against the Guarani and against women, and militarism that is inescapable when you're talking about fossil fuels and pretty much anywhere. But at any point, the part that Pamela is asking about patriarchal excesses, I mean, my reading of this, and here again, I know Pamela's in the book. Many of her observations are actually in the book, and I thank you for that as well. But, against the idea that the Mas represented some indigenous world otherwise, or a kind of Pachamamismo, the celebration of Mother Earth, and we were going to have a decolonizing project. It was going to be revolutionary and based on alternative ontologies and this, that, and the other. There are bits and pieces of that you can see in different aspects of what Mas and social movements try to do. But at the end of the day, Evo Morales and the Mas took hold of a state apparatus, and that was a state apparatus constructed on a long history of military and patriarchal power and patriarchal forms of politics, by which I mean, and here I'm drawing on Pamela and also folks like Silvia Rivera, Maria Galindo, politics that is done by a bunch of men getting together in a back room and making decisions about who gets what. That is a form of redistributive politics. So from a certain leftist perspective, that may satisfy some of your demands for what counts as left. The state was redistributing wealth, but it did not radically, it made small steps in different areas, but it did not radically transform the sort of fundamental structure of the state, and even more so, the fundamental structure of a particular form of party politics. And we first saw this at when they elected the Constitutional Assembly, and the Mas decided, and Mas is a political party, but it was founded and supported by lots of social movements. And the social movements wanted to have their organic role in the Constitutional Assembly. And the Mas said, no, it's going to be political parties. And that was the first major rupture of this sort of utopian vision that what was hopefully going to be a refounding of the country based on its true organic political forces, the social movements and all of their diversity. The political parties reimposed themselves as a central logic. And once the Mas does that, along with it comes that logic, that old logic of party politics, negotiating bits and pieces of the state, mostly between men, mostly in non-democratic spaces. And it expresses itself in things like what I saw among my Guarani leadership friends. A lot of guys getting together, drinking beer and deciding who gets what. And if you didn't agree, you fought, but it was sort of a masculine centric form of politics. And if we're talking about revolutionary transformation, this is what's always plagued the revolutionary left in Latin America, is their inability to radically rethink their connection to masculinism. And I think the Mas suffered from that as well, despite all of the positive gains that it made in different areas. And Pamela, I'd love for you to tomar la palabra and add if you would like to. Or anyone else. Ahí viene.
No, I just wanted to thank you for the book. I used it. I'm using it, and we have great discussions about all these different interfaces of when the weight of patriarchy had a defining sort of like define the course of action that the mass government would take. Evo Morales and the other people who were part of that government. So I just wanted to say, all your books, I mean, the first one on the language of the state, and this book on the gaseous state, have really helped me to rethink the state, rethink, the technologies of power that we as people who were part of social movements, and once we get into the state as functionaries or whatever, the kinds of technologies of power that we deploy. And in the two books that I use, that you wrote, I really got a very specific, very insightful ways to, to critique you too, right? Which is something that you and I like to do, critique each other and really grow from that process. Being able to disagree and be able at the same time to see the other points of view, learn so much from your insights. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Gracias, Pamela. Un abrazo.
Thank you, Pamela. So we're accepting questions from all of you watching. You can put them in the Q&A. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you to speak. And we're here celebrating Bret Gustafson for his really incredible book, Bolivia in the Age of Gas. I have a question, and it sort of builds on Pamela's last comment, or so while we're inviting others to ask, I'll ask, which was Pamela mentioned being able to critique, and I was touched by, Bret, by your reflexivity in this book and the ways in which you were careful to position yourself. And I just found the sort of your political engagement to be really compelling. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about your positionality vis-a-vis, and in particular, the Guarani communities where you have worked and done research. And I'm also curious what kinds of feedback you have received, how many folks there have been able to engage with the arguments in this book, and what that has looked like, and what kind of reception it's receiving there.
Right. So I'll take the last part first. I am in the process of, I've had the book translated. I'm in the process of editing the translation. So as a book, it hasn't circulated yet. Some of the articles that were previously written and previously translated, the one that all my Bolivian friends loved was the one about the Santa Cruz elite, because it had been many years since anyone who had written critically about the elite of Santa Cruz. So that one on bulls and beauty queens was very, at least I guess on the left, you might say, it was very well received, because these are sort of things that everyone knew about, but no one had ever written about publicly. I even got an email from the head of the most extreme fascist organization, thanking me for writing about them, but criticizing me for what I said. I said, okay, well, if they're reading it, then okay. As far as other parts of the book, I did have the part about the Guarani land struggle and the violence that followed. That was translated also to Spanish, and my Guarani friends who care have read it, and in that art, I mean, on all of this thing is some I point out that there was a contradiction, and the government used the Guarani in the name of recovering land, but at the end of the day, the ultimate purpose of the government was to get rid of local political opposition and move forward with that huge gas project. Now, a hardcore Masista might be critical of that take, but the Guarani were kind of like, yeah, that's what happened. That is what happened. So, back to this tension between, are you for Evo or against Evo? Did you want him to run for re-election or not? I often fall on the side of Mas is better than anyone who ever came before. But in the book, as I said before, I tried to point out these contradictions. So that was where I was trying to position myself. And I always, had folks like, I had Pamela sitting on one shoulder, oftentimes as I wrote, and I'm trying to think, okay, what might Pamela say? But I also had, my Guarani friends who, for a time there, they said, if Evo Morales' government falls, they're going to come kill all of us, meaning the right wing. There's a real reactionary violence that was waged against indigenous social movements like the Guarani. And the only thing that protected them was the fact that Evo Morales was still in power. And we saw this after the coup, the unleashing of this repressive force of the state against supporters of Evo Morales. So I had to have them on the other shoulder. I'm not out here to say, well, Evo wasn't a revolutionary like we all thought he would, so I'm just going to trash him. I find that politically reprehensible. This idea that, well, you didn't fit into my model of what a revolution should look like, so you're bad. That's not really scholarship. So I guess to answer your question, I was trying to be as objective as possible, and tell the story in ways that reflected how people there experienced it. There are times, and I was questioned in my first book for being too reflexive. And I guess my point, I'm a white man, and yeah, nobody came here to hear you talk about yourself. So I get that. And what I tried to do in the first book was to say, well, this is when I was thinking in a stupid way, and blah, blah, blah. So in the second book, I didn't think I really tried to do too much of that. The only time was in that chapter on the dead and the dead bodies, which was, that was more me trying to sort out what was true and what wasn't true, and did these dead bodies have any meaning? These people were killed. They were young people, young students, 18, like the age of my kids, and to them, they had gone out there to march for Evo and sacrifice, and were they simply being used as cannon fodder, like Trifonio said he was in the Chaco War? Or what is this really a revolutionary possibility happening? And did they die for a reason? Like those Chaco War, or were they just being used by both the right wing and the Mas? And you have to read the chapter for yourself, and at the end you have to decide for yourself. And I try to leave that open for the reader. and you know, maybe there's not a resolution to that question, and I think that's part of the point is that although Bolivia hasn't suffered from widespread political violence like Colombia and Guatemala and Central America, there is a tendency to sacrifice indigenous bodies as a political instrument. And that's problematic. And that's something that the MAS participated in. And we have to say it. That's what I was trying to do there. I don't know if there was another instance of reflexivity. I tried, you know, I did what I was able to do. I had the intention to write more about sex trafficking in the oils and gas zones, and that was another one that I just never could figure out how to do it. I had the intention to write more about the environmental negative impacts of gas in the Guarani region, and just life happened. It didn't work out that way. So there are lots of other scholars out there who hopefully will write about those things someday as well. I don't know if that answers your question, Angela.
Yeah, that's great. And it goes into my other question. I think you started answering it, was sort of what were the biggest challenges of writing this? And it sounds like there were entire big themes that you would have liked to weave in that you decided to cut. But if you have anything else to say about the decisions that you made to make this book, this beautifully written book, what it is.
Thank you for that. Well, the biggest challenge is when I was on too many search committees and other committees and other service at the university, and could never find time to go to Bolivia or write. And so it's hard to admit this. I mean, this book sort of took 10 years to write. So I guess it came out okay. But who's counting anyway? We're not in a race here, so.
Thank you. If anyone else has questions for Bret Gustafson about Bolivia in the age of gas, we welcome those. You can put them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Everybody's tired.
You predicted a Sunday evening was going to be.
Maybe we should have organized with commentators, then at least their friends would have come too. So
no, I think this has been really great. It's good to just hear you.
Showed up. And thank you to Maria Jimena, who's from the Bolivian Studies Association. Oh, Elizabeth had a hand up again.
Yes. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yes, it's me again. Bret, first of all, really congratulations for this work. And could you talk about your future projects? What is next?
That's a good question. I'll give you two answers. One is that I would like to return to my work on Guarani language. There's the first novel ever written in Guarani. It was written by Elio Ortiz, who sadly passed away at a very young age. He was an emerging Guarani scholar and writer, and he wrote a short novel. And I've been talking to his family. I've actually started translating that to English. So that's one small project. And then I'd also like to return and write more about the history of Guarani language issues. So that's part of me wants to go back to some of the themes I worked on before with language. Because despite all of this indigenous resurgence and all the bilingual education and all the indigenous university, the relentless march of indigenous language loss goes on. Guarani, Aymara, Quechua, this is a paradox of the indigenous resurgence and revitalization, but ongoing language shift or language loss. So that's part of the historical story I want to write. And then I thought, when I got into all this energy stuff, and energy will continue to be central to Bolivian politics. Maybe I should keep writing about energy. I am not going to write about lithium because there are other people out there who are going to write about lithium, but another thing I learned in the process of writing this book is that the Santa Cruz was shaped deeply by U.S. aid, military presence, oil presence. And curiously enough, in the 50s and 60s, when the U.S. electric industry was expanding across the United States through the method of rural cooperatives, which if you live in a rural area, you may have a cooperative instead of a big investor-owned utility providing your electricity. They helped Santa Cruz set up what would become the CRE, Cooperativa Rural Eléctrica of Santa Cruz, and it was set up on the U.S. model of electric cooperative. Sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but there's an interesting politics to this. Those control of those utilities has been central to the power structure in Santa Cruz. And so I thought maybe but that would be really hard to write too. But something about electricity and power in Bolivia. Those are the two things I'm sort of just pedaling on a stationary bicycle right now, because after this book got done and amidst COVID, I just don't really have the energy, no pun intended, to jump back in. But I'm taking suggestions if you have one, Elizabeth. Otra vez, un gusto verte virtualmente.
Maybe I'll ask, well, I would like to, because some folks who are here were not here at the beginning. So let me share what the 3 honorable mentions were. And then I want to ask you a question. There were a lot of intersections with one of them. And so there's a question embedded in this. But again, there were 111 submissions, and Bret's book rose to the top really beautifully. Other honorable mentions who we were also so impressed with were Federico Freitas, Nationalizing Nature, Iguazu Falls and National Parks at the Brazil-Argentina border, which is a history sort of these conjoined national parks at the Iguazu Falls and sort of the politics of this binational region. Another one was called The Fishmeal Revolution, the Industrialization of the Humboldt Current Ecosystem by Kristen Winterstein, which was really also a sort of a study across nations and disciplines, sort of looking at this web of interconnection between fisheries as sites for power struggles, politics, and sciences. And then the third honorable mention that leads into my question is by Thea Rio Franco's Resource Radicals from Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador. And there were, I don't know if you've seen this book, Bret, but there were so many interesting parallels and intersections. And I guess this is not at all my area of expertise. I'm curious, to what extent are scholars who are working on these sort of similar questions across the Americas in dialogue with one another, and what sort of potential do you think there is because I think part of what the selection committee saw was really how these questions were so important across the continent. I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I know Thea, and I have her book sitting around here somewhere, and we actually did a conversation for this outlet called The Baffler, if anyone's curious. I'm sorry she couldn't come today. It would have been good to hear from somebody else besides me. But to your question, yes. So the extractivism, post-extractivism, whatever that might look like if it ever comes, has been the sort of one overarching area for much of the research that I read and that my colleagues are doing. And like Thea's book and my book, basically that we're grappling with this contradiction between left-leaning governments who have supposedly progressive rhetoric and progressive policy ideas, but are dependent on reproducing that old structure of extractive, export-oriented economy, which relies on exporting raw materials with all of the contradictions that produces. So that's the big sort of area within which we fall. I mean, we take it on from different angles. Thea is a political scientist, so she writes more from the those angles. But it's a good kind of political. Sorry, I'm nothing against political scientists, but a lot of political science these days is turned into math. That's not Thea's kind of political science. And I sort of take it on from my wacky, quirky, different angles, which don't have any sort of disciplinary coherence, I don't think. But at any rate, so extractivism is the thing. And where we are now in this conversation is we're trying to sort of, we scholars, social movements are trying to think their way out of it, but scholars are also trying to think their way out of it. And there are different lines emerging. I mean, one is basically the critique of patriarchy. I think that's going to be a major area. The other one is this battle over, kind of a resurgent environmentalism, sort of, and that's creating these weird political animals, like what we're seeing in Bolivia is coalitions between right-wing middle class people talking about the defense of the rainforest. What's going on here? But they're doing it in the context of trying to undermine the project of the MAS. So, what I always say is, far be it from me to tell Bolivians not to extract gas. I mean, my shower is heated with gas every morning. I cook on gas. Our furnace comes from gas. I don't see you having a real strong position being anti-gas in this particular context. And it's easy to critique extractivism. It's hard to imagine, and it's hard to think about ways to think beyond extractivism. So other scholars like Arturo Escobar write the pluriverse and work like this, and the ontological turn. But at the end of the day, it's very different. One of the biggest, Maristela Spampa is a key voice in these debates, critiquing this connection between patriarchy and extractivism, whether right or left. Gudinas in Ecuador, one of his big proposals is, well, let's do more ecotourism. I was like, well, that sounds great. Costa Rica's sort of become an ecotourism site instead of an extractivist site. But then you basically open your country to be a playground for wealthy gringos. Is that revolutionary utopianism? So I think, we're still in the process of, how can we reimagine economies, local forms of producing energy, different relationships to land, to agriculture, to animals, to food. This is something that we want to see, but we haven't been able to imagine that yet, or at least I haven't. So perhaps I'm wrong. I hope I am. Hi. Oh, there is. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question, Angela.
Yeah, I just want to hear you speak more about all this work. It's great. Thank you.
Hi. Yes, Gisela, I called you out earlier, but you weren't here, so I'll call you out again. Thank you for being a part of this, and thank you for coming today.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm sorry I'm late, but just so proud to have played a tiny little role in bringing your book out. So proud that you got this award. Congratulations.
Thank you. I will tell the story that I always tell. I told it on this podcast. Initially, this project was going to be about this pipeline that goes from Bolivia to Brazil. And it's going to write this whole book following the pipeline and whatever, the life of the pipeline. It goes all the way to Sao Paulo. So you have gas coming out of Guarani, very rural, very poor villages, massive amounts of gas that goes and basically fuels, quite literally, that industrial center of Sao Paulo. And I took a few trips to Brazil rode a bus across the length of the thing. And I had started studying all this Brazilian side of things. And back to Angela's question about what took so long, or what made it in the book, or what didn't make it in the book. I started, I had this idea I was going to write about Brazil and Bolivia. And I went to a AAA or a LASA, I can't remember which one it was, and I was chatting with Gisela. Every year I'd say, I'm working on it. I think one year, I don't even know if you remember this, Gisela, you said, why don't you just write about Bolivia? And that was so liberating. And I was like, yeah, what are you thinking? So I have tons of archives of stuff on Brazil. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to send it to you. You can write the Brazil side of the book, but that's the big thing I owe Gisela as editor, is helping me to rein in an non-feasible idea, basically. So at least unfeasible for me. Some other scholar might have pulled it off, but I sure couldn't. So thank you for that. I owe you one.
I was just hoping for one book. You were trying to write 5 or 6, so trying to rein you in. Just
Thank you. I
one of my
appreciate it.
roles.
Probably wish you would have said that 4 or 5 years earlier, but it wouldn't matter. I couldn't. Too much other stuff going on. So, un abrazo.
Well, I want to congratulate you both, Gisela, for your incredible editing work, and Bret for bringing this book to life and sharing it with us all. It was, again, an honor to serve on this committee and get to read so many really compelling pieces of scholarship, and yours in particular. So I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. Bret, I don't know if you want to hang around for another 15 or 20 minutes, or if we should wrap up now. How are you feeling?
I don't see hands up. I was just writing thank you in the chat, but I guess since I've got the mic, I can just say that. So gracias de nuevo a todos. Sorry we couldn't be there in person to hang out. We'll have to wait till next year. But quite literally, almost everyone in the list, all the people I know at least, played a role in this book as well, whether you knew it or not. So thank you again for that.
That's beautiful.
To the committee, someday next year, we'll all meet at LASA.
I'm looking forward to that. Congratulations again, Bret, and thanks everyone for coming. Have a
Thank
great
you.
evening.
Thank you. Thank you.